because we've been talking about the budget for the past couple of weeks. We've been analyzing the announcements made by the government side, the promises made by the PNP side. But what areas of the stock market could take a hit or could benefit as a result of the things that have been announced?
Well, quite a bit has been mentioned, particularly in the presentation by the finance minister, that could have some impact on the market. And I know generally when we think of budget presentations, you start out to think what is in it for me as an individual. But I think, what we want to look at is how it is that it could benefit areas on the stock market that could then eventually be of benefit to you. I think when we think of probably, the one that's talked about most, which should have been the increase in the income tax threshold, and you think about, what will come to you as an individual on a monthly basis, it seems a little, I think, as your earlier panelists mentioned, it is a bit non-material. But when you think of the cumulative spend, so if it is just 2,000 per person, but when you think about where that could go with everyone who is getting an additional 2,000 per month, then you consider that there could be added benefits within the stock market. And if it is, as mentioned, $2,000 per month, then what you're looking at is that you probably find that that cash just gets petered out into probably consumer discretionary or some consumer staples. So things that you regularly buy at supermarket are probably something you wouldn't normally buy, but it's not too expensive. And so that means that there's a potential that that fund or those cash is really going into the areas of the economy that could benefit in terms of from stock market. So whether it is like, persons may go to a Fontana or a regular supermarket, then those could be areas that could benefit on a cumulative basis. And when you think about, $2,000 per person being spent additionally per month. I think another one mentioned would have been the micro market on
Yes.
the stock exchange, which is quite
Very
exciting.
curious to hear your thoughts on that. Is that feasible, you think?
Well, at this point, what they're doing is looking to establish a technical working committee. So there has been, as the minister presented, that the JSE has already been looking, and they're seeing that there are some companies that could be suitable to fit into this category. And so there'll be a little bit more work in development to see how exactly that could work. I think what it will bring, though, is for some investors to be able to participate in a different way. So I think along with micro markets on the JSC, what will come is also education in terms of how it is that micro companies or smaller companies in terms of their development. And so the expectation of how it is when you give capital to companies at that size and at that stage of development, what it really means. And so you could find that investors benefit for in terms of looking with a much longer term horizon. That could be beneficial. So it'll be giving investors an opportunity to benefit from companies that are coming from a very young stage in their development and able to work and grow with them over time. I think generally the market or the investment market will be open because I think we're generally supportive of growth within our economy. And so it will mean a bit of a change because there may not be companies that they're typically looking at in this regard. And so it may just mean that there will be a little bit more working to do in terms of the investment banking end. But it does present as something that's quite interesting and very good for the overall market as well as for us in terms of investors.
What special considerations do you think companies of that size may need if they're supposed to list on a micro stock exchange?
I think, well, one of the things that your earlier panelists would have mentioned is that quite a bit of companies that are micro and small are not as active in terms of financial preparation. So they tend to have an idea of what they're working or what it is that they're making, but in terms of having proper record management. So I think support, and the government generally for the years have been giving support to micro and small companies. And I think extending some of those in terms of the development or how it is that they can grow or develop their businesses in terms of better financial presentation would be one. And as usual, seeing that the junior market has a tax exempt, there would be that area that investors would be looking for, as well as those micro companies would be probably seeking in that regard as well.
We have the Prime Minister left to go. We have the Finance Minister preparing to do her closing as well. What measures would you like to see in their presentation specifically for business?
Well, I think the industry I work in, and where we look, in terms of, but it was already mentioned. I think one of the disproportionate in terms of tax measures is really the asset tax. I think both parties would have touched on it thus far, with the current administration pointing out that they are likely to, express some of the ideas that have been presented by the industry in terms of how it is that they can look to see, whether it is a phasing out or a reduction. And we'd have seen where the opposition spokesman on finance would have pointed out that the opposing party has a plan in terms of phasing it out over a period of time. I think, when you think of a tax that is for insurance companies, security dealers, as well as deposit taking institutions, it is an additional hit for those companies. And I think, it's one of those areas that as investors, and I think earlier, one of your panelists would have mentioned in terms of lower tax for some of those larger companies. So if those are implemented, those are areas where investors should really look to see how it is that once those things are highlighted, in terms of positioning your portfolio to adopt, to make some amount of gains in that regard. I think just mentioning in terms of what David mentioned about dividend companies, one of the things to note as well is that with a bit of a change in terms of capital gains or in terms of interest rates coming down, you saw a bit of a shift towards a lot of the dividend paying stocks on the market. So persons were, a bit out of the stock market for a period of time because they were able to put the money in safe cash, such as, BOJ, CDs, or repo rates. With those rates coming down, you found that persons made a move to try and still gain some amount of good income. And so they would have shifted a bit to those dividend paying stocks. And I think careers would have been one of those that persons really flocked to or liked, and that would have helped in terms of the boost for that price movement. But also, the minister mentioned in her presentation, and we'd have touched on it earlier in the panel discussion, that there would be a bit of standardization for dividend, for the withholding tax on dividend income. And I think what that presents is an opportunity for persons who are overseas or companies overseas who may have been thinking to look at dividend stocks, but may have thought that the tax component of it was a bit too high, that it could also aid a bit in terms of the trading for some of those companies that are strong in terms of dividend payments.
All right, David, I'll give you the last word. I don't know if you've been following the budget debates, but anything in particular you would like to hear from our leaders?
I have to be following the budget debate, Kalila. It affects all of us. So just to respond to some things that Jody and would have mentioned earlier. So the asset tax, it's just an unfortunate symptom of what I'd call low compliance. What do I mean by that? So the government is owed over $100 billion in taxes, and if the government is able to collect 5-10% of that amount, consistently, it wouldn't be a situation where the government has to be retaining this asset tax on the fincos, because one thing about it is these its asset tax is not tax deductible, so it doesn't know your taxable income. It's an expense, but it doesn't know your taxable liability. So that's one part of it. The second thing is, when it comes down to that whole withholding tax reduction rate, Kalila, I think that a lot of persons might have overestimated what the finance minister was trying to posit, because here's the thing about it: the reduction in withholding tax rate based on the revenue measures that were published by the Ministry of Finance, that is only going to see a reduction of about $9 million in revenue for the government. And the reason why is the reduction in the tax rate is only for non-resident individuals and companies that don't have tax treaties with Jamaica. So the persons who are still using the solution IBCs, persons who were already, let us say, using or tax treaty with Canada or USA, it's already 15% in some cases. So if you're a person or citizen from a country that's a tax resident, with Jamaica tax treaty with Jamaica, it works out in your favor to pay less in withholding taxes. But you have companies, like a Kingston Wars, which as a result of being an SEZ, starting last year in 2024, there's no withholding tax applied on dividends. So it's a Jamaican company, but based on other legislative measures or benefits it has accrued under the SEC Act, there's no withholding tax applied on the dividends paid to its shareholders. So the reality is the tax collection and compliance and effectiveness in that tax collection is really where the government needs to be going forward. It's good to hear that the Minister of Finance Havel Williams spoke to having tax office open on weekends to reduce some of the traffic that is in the tax offices during the weekdays. But that tax collection, and that effective tax collection is really where we need to move forward, because the reality is, if we were having a situation where taxes were collected more effectively, efficient at the IRS, you probably wouldn't see the government saying it's TGH shares, for example. We're using other creative measures of monetization to fund some of these givebacks that we are so accustomed to, as we keep hearing no new taxes every year. But just one last item in terms of what I want to see from the budget is really when it comes on to what I'd call somewhat more targeted measures and education to the general public, especially for small businesses. So what do I mean by that? So someone at customs has pointed out to me, and this is why I say that education is a critical component to our program and other mediums, that there's something called a productive input relief. It's basically a measure that allows for you to bring in key inputs, let us say capital, machinery, and so forth, at a lower duty than you would pay just by bringing it in normally. Like some of these key or this piece of information, if they're more promulgated to the public, could seriously benefit small businesses, alongside, just having more relatively tax-friendly measures to facilitate smaller businesses to be encouraged to become formalized. So adjusting the GCT registration threshold to $50 is one thing, but something that the SME business president pointed to, which I think is a step forward that we need to consider or make it available, is switching from the tax payable based on an accrual basis to a cash basis, which would really work out better for all of the businesses that currently report or pay taxes on an accrual basis, since you might sell goods on credit, but you might not collect it in time when you need to pay taxes. And with respect to the micro market, I really hope that technical committee engages the public, because I think the JSC is really a disservice to investors in not strengthening the what I call the rules and enforcement of the junior market companies. I don't think it's right that you're gone 15, 16 years to junior market now, and the companies on that market don't face any monetary fines for any breaches of the rules. And reality speaking is, I'm glad to see these small businesses get the chance to have a space to have an incubator to try and grow, but the audit fees, the compliance fees, Jody mentioned it, that infrastructure you put in place to properly monitor your income, expenses, and everything else in between. It's not a thing that you can just snap and get right overnight.
Yeah, I was at a panel today, and one of the panelists was mentioning that the minimum to do an audit is $500,000.
No, that's correct. And the thing is, it also depends on the complexity of the business, what kind of support you on your side have, because what most people don't appreciate is that the company is the one prepares the financial statements. The auditor is the one that comes in and says, hey, we're doing a verification to say that what the company has prepared makes sense and is fair and true. So if the company themselves are not in that state, to be ready for audits, or are struggling to gather evidence and be ready for that structure, it's going to incur additional costs for those businesses. And on top of that, we're currently seeing a situation whereby auditors, where there's a relative auditor shortage in the space, which means that for these smaller companies, you might have to give them a longer timeline to submit the audited financials, because an auditor is going to prioritize their high-dollar clients vis-a-vis the smaller businesses. And even when it comes on to the audits, there are just some auditors that in the Jamaican space I'm very apprehensive of. The auditors that come in the JSC, and the gaps that I see that they don't catch are quite concerning. So these are just some things I'm pushing forward in terms of things that I see going forward in the budget, whether this government or another government takes place. We need to give small business space and education and knowledge to truly thrive. A lot of persons don't want about the productive input tax relief or productive input relief, and just other little measures that can benefit them tremendously.
Yeah, definitely. We need to see what is going to come out of that working group, and we need to be monitoring it. And hopefully, there's going to be public consultation as well, because I think it can work, but there need to be special concessions.